And thank you for coming. Thank you for letting me talk about my research, which I can and will do at length. There will be an opportunity to ask questions in the chat if you prefer. You can also send me a message. I'm on Twitter, and this is my email. If you think of something a bit later on when you watch the recording, or you'd like to ask a question more privately, then very much feel free to get in touch with me. I'm going to talk to you about what is the main metaphor for what I do my research on, which is the leaky pipeline, and it looks like this. So it is a metaphor for the phenomenon that means that we start off in undergraduate levels at UK and lots of other universities across the world with about equal representation of men and women. It tends to then stay very similar at postgraduate levels. And then something happens when you get to the career work stages where women seem to fall out of, if you think of a career not as a ladder, but as a pipeline, women leak out of this pipeline. So at professor level, of all professors in the UK, only 22.6% of the professors in STEM are women. So something happened because there were originally 51.63%. So over half of them were lost. Because there's a women in physics groups, I got an example for the leaky pipeline I made for physics. I hope you're impressed by my Excel skills, my graph making skills. The vulnerabilities in the leaky pipeline are recruitment, retention, and progression. So we need to get women in. We need to be able to retain them once they're there, then they also need to be progressed. Different subjects have different vulnerabilities within that. So you see physics do okay, not as well as the average for recruitment, able to retain pretty well lots of their undergraduates, women into postgraduate study, and then the effects really hit after that. Where only 12% of all professors in physics are women. And together they look like this. If you have a problem seeing color, the two lines that are essentially pointing up towards the professor stage represent men, and the two other lines that point down represent women. If you have any questions about those data sets, then definitely ask me after, because there's a lot to be said about that. And even though my research is primarily about women, if we look at professors across all subjects, 26.7% are women, but 90.89% of those are white women. The leaky pipeline doesn't exclusively impact women. There is a problem around recruitment, retaining, and progressing women. But if you look at the intersectional experiences of women who also are members of other demographic groups that tend to be marginalized, there is an additional underrepresentation that you see in professor stages. And professor stages are so important because if you want to go as far as you can in teaching or in research and academic or research careers, it is as far as you can go. There are other positions higher than that, but they tend to focus on leadership. So professor is a very good measure of that objective career success. And as you can see from this table, women of color, people of color, are also very underrepresented, but in intersection of being a woman of color means there is an additional underrepresentation at professor level, and that becomes particularly when you see Black women. There isn't any data set available that clarifies how many of professors in the UK are Black and who are women in STEM subjects. That isn't aggregated or released. HESA has it, but they won't release it. You can see that it's very, very low. 0.2% of professors in STEM are Black. So there's more than just a gender issue going on. That is what I'll focus on, but we need to be aware of the wider issues. Because what we want is to make an academia and research an inclusive space for everyone, not just women. There are different definitions of STEM, just to clarify the ones I use. It is the he, subject, subject codes, and it includes these 10 subjects, and each of them have subgroups. So psychology, for example, which is my subject, comes within biological sciences. So why is it then that women don't progress in the same way? Why, especially when it comes to the career stages, are women less, so much more likely to be leaking out of this pipeline? One argument that you see presented sometimes is that women would be able to stay if they were just good enough. Maybe they're not good enough or smart enough or clever enough. Systematic research that looks at the wider cognitive variables that could explain intelligence or problem solving or other factors that could contribute to why someone would succeed in their career, be good at the job, showed that there consistently isn't a very large number of areas where men and women are different. The few exceptions that have been found include motor skills, such as throwing velocity and distance, which is very, very rarely relevant to academic career progression in STEM. More than that, some have argued that there are biological differences between men and women that explains why they are more or less able to do their job. And again, not just a meta-analysis, but a meta-synthesis, which is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So you're really, really reducing that sampling error that you see in potentially other studies. I found that there are very few neurological differences between men and women's brains. That has been argued as one of the earliest arguments for why women shouldn't have access to education. For example, there used to be a completely made up diagnosis called anorexia scholastica that was thought to befall women and girls who learned to read and write, and it would make them immoral, insane, and asexual. So it's a triple whammy for women learning to read and write. And even though that is not subscribed to anymore, it's very much the cultural heritage that still colors our belief systems now. These might not be accurate, but such claims of gender differences in abilities, especially cognitive abilities, are important because they come at cost of women's opportunities in the workplace, and they are not evidence-based. So if it's not women being less able, we can then look at how we measure success in academia, and especially how we judge performance. And one of the claims is that academia is fair because it's a meritocracy. But if you look at the evidence again, at every single stage, women are disadvantaged. They are less likely to be taken into elite level postgraduate positions at elite labs. They are less likely to be shortlisted for interviews. They are less likely to get good recommendation letters in subjects where that is still a thing. There are really, really good studies that compare CVs that are candidates that are either made up or that are real, where they see that male candidates are rated as more competent and hireable than equally qualified or identical CVs of women. And if they manage to get their way into a position, women are then judged differently in terms of career progression. So women are more likely to be judged against having already been required to meet the criteria for leadership positions, but men are judged against the potential to do that in the future. These social stereotypes that men will meet and the social environment are usually referred to as the chilly climate. So that is the social environment that means that some women, because of their gender, are more likely to face bullying, sexual harassment, and have, very importantly, lower or reduced access to social support and social capital. When there is efforts to reduce bureaucracy in promotional processes, for example, by taking away Venus 1 requirements, this has been proven to disadvantage women's career progression, because when nobody loves admin, but when you take away these formal checks and requirements and performance standards, codes of conduct, it increases ambiguity, it increases space for people to make informal decisions of performance criteria and for informal deals to be made. An expression of that is that men are almost 50% more likely to report promotional criteria as clear. And it gets worse. Universities that explicitly identify as a meritocracy, where people progress on merit and not because of any undue reason, men are more likely to be recruited over equally qualified women, and they get more money. A very big reason for why there is such a big disparity in progression and retention in STEM subjects, where the effect is more acute, is the funding requirement. And we see that women are less likely to get funded. In the academic years 2014 to 15 to 18-19, so in that 5-year period, there were 3,020 projects funded to research run by men as PIs, compared to 510 projects run by women. Women apply less often and for smaller sums than men, that is true, but they are disproportionately unlikely to be awarded funding that they asked for. In that period, 14% of the sum that was spent on men was spent on women by the largest funding body in the UK. And it continues. So this is out of date by a year, but it doesn't matter because not a single woman won a Nobel Prize in the STEM subject last year. So what I will tell you and what I will focus on from here is what we can do about it. But I want to make it in arguments. We're not going to talk about what has been made famous by Sheryl Sandberg. She wrote a book in 2013. You might know her as the CEO of Facebook. And in this book, she argues that women have the opportunities to progress in their careers. They have the same opportunities men do, but women choose to opt out, to lean back from these opportunities because they're very, very concerned about their precious work-life balances. And if they only would lead into the opportunities, they would succeed. It's worth noting that it's one of the highest ranked books in the Hawking Index, which is the list of books that are bought but not finished, not read. And that's something that you can measure through, for example, Kindles. Sources like Amazon can measure how many purchases and how progressed people are in a book. Lean-in arguments that are not just exclusively made by Sheryl Sandberg are problematic because they assume that everyone has the same access to all opportunities and supports, and they do not. There is not a contextual vacuum to people's career progression. And it focuses on this victim blaming approach where you're teaching women to be fixed and not looking at any disadvantages experienced by other marginalized groups. So I'm going to talk about 2 projects that I've been involved in. One is VisNet, which is a really, really cool study. I'm so lucky I got to be involved with this. It was run by a whole bunch of women. The top 3 names here, Carolyn Gauchot-Lindsay, Helen Mulvanna, and Professor Catherine Hido, were the PIs on this. And I was very lucky to come in as a postdoc. They did research on retention of women who were postdocs in engineering in Scotland. And they did a whole bunch of things, really, really good things. And I'm going to be very brief and focused on just the networking. So they looked at what these women who were postdocs in engineering and their professional networks, what they looked like. They got them to map that out, and they found these 4 main patterns that either they were very much reliant on their lab manager, so they weren't really independently centered around themselves, or they were very kind of close clusters that didn't work or were related to each other, or they were the opposite, they were just completely different. They weren't very strong, very warm relationships, and there was very little connection between the different people they were professionally connected to. And then they did a whole bunch of things, lots of training. There was coaching, there was mentoring. Visnet arranged a big conference where collaborators were invited, and there was opportunity to present their own research, to showcase what they did. And after that, and all this training, I found that the networks then became, first of all, much bigger. There were more network contacts. They were more centered around themselves and not who they worked for. And they became more connected. And some of the postdocs got new jobs as a direct result of that networking. And the second project I'm going to talk about is my PhD research. And I've got this graph of the leaky pipeline. I know it's a little bit outdated with the numbers, but I like how it really exemplifies this graph of a leaking pipeline. And I'm trying to find individual and organizational factors that contribute to women making it to professor, because not everyone leaks out. Some women do make it. So what has been important for them in terms of the individual and organizational factors? To find out that, I traveled all over the UK. I added up all the train distances, and it was 6,700 miles put together. I interviewed 71 women who were hugely different from one another. They were all based in the UK, not necessarily from the UK. They were ethnically different. They were different ages. They had different family structures. And I analysed all of that into an enormous data set and used analysis called reflexive analysis. So you're going to see some quotes, and I just want to give a heads up that if you see any names associated with the quotes, these are pseudonyms. So I didn't actually interview Marie Curie. They're just pseudonyms taken from famous women in science. And some of the most important things that came from that is that I thought I would find that there was either a type of woman or a shared path they had taken to become professor, and so few do. But the shared characteristics were that they didn't have a shared characteristic. Many of them were surprised to find that they became professor. And I think that is really important, because if you are early career, or if you kind of want to become a professor, you don't really know, if you don't feel like you are the kind of professor that you see around you, that was not a problem for these women. It might have been hard, but it wasn't a barrier that stopped them from becoming promoted to professor. What they often had in common was this shared passion and love for the subject. And it could be learning, it could be the independence that was offered in that kind of role. Not necessarily the title of professor, but for a very small number that was the case, and that is fine and that is great. But for most, by far the majority of the 71 women I talked to, it was not something they had in common, that they had a strong early ambition to become professor. And that is important, because it's important to make out this leaky pipeline, because that shows us that there is a gender disparity, and it also maps onto other demographic groups, that they are also marginalized. But we can be a bit limited in how we measure career success. And what really came out of these interviews that there are other measures, and some of them are far more subjective. That they felt like the career ambition was not to get a specific title, it was to feel like they made a contribution to their field, that they had a good environment, that they made a meaningful contribution to science and to their colleagues, and that they were satisfied in their job. Another thing that I find very enlightening about this research is that if you're not that motivated to become a specific title to progress, that's fine. But having the titles and having the acknowledgements that represent this objective career success is meaningful to have for yourself. To have a PhD is not just something that matters within an academic career structure. In industry and a third sector, that can also be something that opens doors. It increases your independence and where you can go because it matters to other employers. One of the most important things that the professors kept referring to was to have good social support. You can't do everything on your own, and having that shared support system is very important, especially if there are so few women in the first place. And one of the disadvantages of there being so few women in these very highest positions in science is that there are fewer people at their level who they felt like they could talk to, because it becomes inappropriate to sometimes in a leadership position to fully vent about what's going on about someone's colleague, if that is something that causes stress and frustration. So becoming more lonely if women are so underrepresented in these very senior positions. We often celebrate that women are role models, and we should. That is very good. But there are nuances to it. So it's not just, for example, important for us to have women as role models, as professors, in leadership, in all these positions. It's also important for everyone to have that as reference points, and that extends beyond gender. We need to be able to see a far more diverse group of people. And when we think of who's an effective leader, we're not just thinking about this bearded old man. We have a wider range of ideas of who that could be, because that's what we see around us. But when women are recommended to do that, they sometimes argue that when they became professor, quite a few said they were the first, not just in their department ever, to become professor. And this is not that long ago. Some of them said that they were the first to go part-time. They were the first to take maternity leave or have children. So there's a lot of ground still being broken by women. And by being the only one, or the first, or one of the very, very few who did all these slightly different career paths, or who expressed their careers in different ways with work-life balance, they became that department's entire experience with being led by a woman, by having a woman as a professor, by having a mother as a professor. And so they felt like they represented everyone in that social group. And that became a huge burden. So when we celebrate women, that is a good thing, but we have to be mindful of the pressure that can come with, and do what we can to reduce that. Another way of offering social support is mentoring. And that is something that kept coming up. It can take a lot of different shapes and forms. Often it is offered as a formal setting to especially early careers as new starters. But the professor said that especially when they became professor and taking up these new and very senior positions or other positions in leadership, they still wanted that support of a mentor then. And there were, for example, some of them were asked to join a mentoring scheme, and they say, yes, please, but I don't want to be the mentor. I want to be the mentee. I want the help and support. People don't stop learning just because they take on these new positions and they're not young anymore. And again, a bit more nuanced. An aspect of the formal mentoring and informal mentoring is that it's relatively new that mentoring is formally assigned, that someone at an organizational level tries to match who can be a good mentor, who can give advice, give information, be a sounding board to these often earlier career people. But there's not a lot of volunteering going into who wants to be a mentee and a mentor, and not everyone is willing or capable of standing into that role. It can be a very demanding role. It can be a very intimate relationship, and the match can be very difficult to formally assign. And there have been examples in my research of when this match has not gone as well. Although it's worth noting that those who said they never had any mentoring, formal or otherwise, would rather have a formal mentor that could work than to see that other people had mentoring that worked and they didn't have any. But learning from both BizNet and my professor research, what we can do about that is to think broadly around mentoring and networking, so that there was especially something that came up in BizNet, that the postdocs tended to look for mentors up and not consider peers as successful mentors. And to become a postdoc or to even do a PhD, you have to have a huge amount of competence to get that far. You have to prove a lot and do a lot in that role. And our peers around us can be very, very effective mentor. We don't necessarily have to only get that from someone more senior. But we also have to think about what we want from a mentoring scheme, because if you want someone to sponsor opportunities for you, that is not a mentoring scheme. Of what a mentoring role would do. Some people would not like to give advice, but they would only like sounding boards. Some people might find that there are so many different expertise areas. So one person can be a really effective mentor for you for publishing, and another can be in terms of career progression and what universities or potential industry partners are good. What could you do if you wanted to start up a spin-out company? I don't believe in monogamy in mentoring. Lots of different mentors can offer you lots of different things at different times. So thinking broadly about that is definitely a benefit. One of the common barriers to promotion within organizational is the academic workload. It's massive, and what we see now is close to a national burnout. People are incredibly busy just keeping their head above water, and the workloads became problematic because it's so hard to just do your workload. Finding out about promotional criteria, how to get support in filling out a form, all this information that isn't always so accessible, or it's accessible but ambiguous, is difficult. And having massive workloads becomes a barrier, and women are more likely to do that. They're certainly more likely to do workload tasks that are related to teaching and admin and academic citizenship, which tend to carry lower promotional value. So the key takeaway points I need to take from this is that, first of all, there isn't such a thing as a typical professor, and looking to past success to define what professors or career success would look like now is a limitation. We will get much further in not just making academia and research a better place for women, but for other groups as well, if we address the structural and systemic factors, rather than train women to cope with the systemically faulty and hostile environment. And that's it. Let me hear your questions.